I have become more and more fascinated with the life of David, especially with how he handles betrayal. So as I've been going through 1 Samuel, I have reviewed endless accounts of times that David was betrayed. And so let's go over a few of those. Number one, I feel like David was betrayed even by his dad and brothers when Samuel came to anoint the king. So Samuel is sent on a journey by God, and he's like, go to the house of Jesse. There's a boy there that needs to be anointed the new king of Israel. And so Samuel walks in and he sees this tall, beaming man, and he's like, surely that's God's appointed. And so he wants to anoint this oldest son of Jesse, and God says no. And so then he says, well, maybe it's the next brother in line, and God says no again. And you know the story that Samuel cycles through all of the children present, and none of them are God's man. None of them are the ones that God wanted to anoint for the task of being king over Israel. And so Samuel's probably standing there scratching his head. And here's where the betrayal, I think, comes in. Why did Jesse, who knew all of his children, who had named them, who gives them their roles, who commands the jobs that they perform, who organizes and authorizes the family, why didn't he say, hey, Samuel, I've got one more? Why did none of the brothers who knew about their runt brother David, why did none of them speak up and say, hey, well, Samuel, since it's not us, we know it's probably this brother over here. None of them said a word until Samuel asked. So you can see there is a type of betrayal here from the very beginning. Well, it's not long that David is in favor with the king, with King Saul, because he kills Goliath. But then in the presence of King Saul tries to kill David twice. And we can consider those serious betrayals. Later, we see that David is actually helping to protect Nabal's sheep and income and empire. And then when David just asks for a little bit of food, Nabal says, no way, David. Who is David? I don't know David, the son of Jesse. I don't know the giant slayer. Are you kidding? We also find out that Doeg the Edomite, who was there when David was on the run, turned David in. We also find another point that David and his men go in and deliver the inhabitants of Keilah, and they turn on David. Even before they could turn on David, the bad guys are coming. Saul and his army's about to get David. David goes to the Lord. He says, will the men of Keilah give me up? And God says, oh yeah, they're going to give you up. And so as David progresses along, he also runs in to the scenario that Absalom is going to betray him in later years as well. We find out that the Philistines don't want David fighting with them, and King Achish doesn't even stay on David's side, and so they kind of reject David. Then when David gets home, he finds out that his entire family had been taken away by the Amalekites. Everything they owned, all of their possessions were gone. David's own men turned on him and were threatening to stone him. David had absolutely no one and nothing left except God. Now, if you look at all these times, is that 6, 7, 8 times? And we're not even into 2 Samuel yet. But David is repeatedly betrayed. He is betrayed time and time again by people around him, men that should be appreciative of him, men that are his brothers and sisters, men that should be leading him or should be appreciative of the work he's done for them. And David is betrayed and betrayed and betrayed and betrayed. Now, David in this scenario looks around and he can trust no man. And so this should be very clear for us. Then who are we to trust? Well, don't really trust men. You need to trust God, because all of these men down here will turn upon you. Your family even will turn upon you. Your best friends will turn upon you. Your spiritual leaders will turn upon you at times. So David took strength in the Lord. Well, I began to wonder also about David, since he was a man after God's own heart. Like we see that Jesus, being God in the flesh, he dealt with betrayal on a regular basis. He had the masses betray him. His own family betrayed him. His disciples betrayed him. Judas betrayed him. Everyone betrayed him. And so you can see there that if David was a man after God's own heart, then David and Jesus both wrestled with understanding betrayal. And I started looking into the heart of this. I'm like, what is betrayal exactly? And betrayal is when you do good for others and they do not return that goodness to you, or they actually return evil for good. Now, if Jesus was the ultimate man and our ultimate example, and if David was a man after God's own heart, and we look at both of them who wrestled often and constantly with betrayal, then we need to be familiar and understand what betrayal is. And the commitment there is that we are going to do good for those around us, no matter how much they let us down, no matter what kind of evil that they do to us, no matter what sinful things they allow to destroy our relationship. You will see that Jesus and David always did more good for those around them than those around them were doing unto them in the first place. Now this brings me to another point. And if David was a man after God's own heart, and if David and Jesus had so much in common in dealing with betrayal and pain, and both of them did good for others more than anybody did back to them, they were actually forces for good, and were not dependent on good being done for them. They were always proactively doing good, and it didn't matter if anybody else was doing good to them. They were going to be good no matter what. Then it begs the question, in a sense, do we need to be acquainted with the same type of pain? You see, it's funny because when we come to Christ in our secularized minds, we think that the closer that I get unto God, maybe the more joyous and the more pristine and the more wonderful life is supposed to get. But at this point in the journey, we don't see that in the life of David. The more David does good, the more David commits to doing right, the more loyal David is to spiritual principles, the more betrayal he faces. Jesus, the same fashion. He did good all of the time and received evil in like manner. So can you imagine the state and feeling of David and Jesus' hearts as they lived? These men were acquainted with increasing pain. So my question to you, in your comprehension of what spiritual maturity is, or Christian growth, is it that the emotions of your life are going to get better and better and higher and more joyous? Or that you might feel more of what grieves the Lord Himself?